The smell of roasting pig and fresh-cut grass hung heavy in the summer air of Redemption, Nevada. It was the 4th of July, 1878, and the whole town had gathered in the dusty square between the church and the general store. Arthur Vance leaned against a water trough, nursing a tin cup of lukewarm lemonade, feeling the familiar ache of an outsider looking in. He'd been running his small cattle spread a few miles out of town for 3 years, but he was still just Vance, the quiet man who kept to himself. He watched the couples dancing a clumsy waltz to a fiddler's tune, the married men boasting about their herds, the women gossiping in tight circles. Then he saw her. My Lin, or Mrs. Chen as the town called her. She stood near the edge of the gathering, a small bowl of potato salad held in both hands, her posture a study in stillness. Her husband had been a worker on the railroad spur line, killed in a rockslide the previous winter. Since then, she'd lived alone in their small clapboard cabin by the creek, a ghost at the edge of town life. The preacher's wife, a woman whose charity often felt like a display, had made a point of inviting her today. It was a gesture of inclusion that only highlighted her isolation. A few of the younger ranch hands, emboldened by corn liquor, were laughing loudly near the barbecue pit. Jedediah Stokes, whose father owned the biggest spread in the valley, clapped a fellow rancher on the back. You'd best make your move on the Miller girl, son, before she's spoken for. Good women are scarcer than gold nuggets in a dry creek. The comment, casual and cruel in its assessment of unmarried women as dwindling stock, grated on Arthur. He saw their eyes flicker toward My Lin, a flicker of pity mixed with something else, something that made his jaw tighten. She was a curiosity, a problem without a solution in their simple world. Something reckless and protective rose in him. He didn't think. He just moved. He pushed himself off the trough and walked straight toward her, his boots kicking up little puffs of ochre dust. The small conversations around them faltered as he approached. He stopped in front of her, aware of every eye on his back. Her own dark eyes, clear and deep, met his without wavering. She wasn't frightened, just watchful. He tipped his hat, the gesture feeling clumsy. Mrs. Chen. She gave a slight, formal nod. Mr. Vance. His mind went blank. He'd had no plan beyond interrupting the stares. The silence stretched, becoming a spectacle. He had to say something, anything to fill the space. The ranch hands were grinning now, waiting for the show. The foolish words tumbled out of his mouth before he could stop them, meant as a joke, a shield to deflect the town's pity and his own awkwardness. Mrs. Chen, he said, his voice louder than he intended, all these fellas are looking for a wife. Seems a shame to waste such a fine afternoon with tedious negotiations. To save you the trouble of listening to them all, why don't you just marry me? He finished with a half smile, expecting her to blush, to look away, to offer a polite, dismissive laugh that would let them both escape the moment. The crowd let out a few chuckles. Jedediah Stokes guffawed. Arthur felt a flush of heat crawl up his neck, regretting his impulsive gesture. But My Lin did not blush. She did not laugh. Her expression remained perfectly serene, her gaze locked on his. She considered his ridiculous, public, joking proposal with the gravity of a banker weighing gold. After a long, humming moment that silenced the entire town square, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with absolute clarity. I thought you'd never ask, cowboy. The laughter died in an instant. A collective gasp seemed to suck the air from the square. Jedediah's mouth hung open. The preacher's wife looked as if she'd been struck. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't an acceptance. It was a checkmate. He had laid a foolish trap for the town's amusement, and she had calmly stepped into it and pulled him in with her. He was pinned, caught by his own words in front of every soul in Redemption. He, Arthur Vance, had just become engaged to the Chinese widow, and he had no idea how it had happened. The walk back to her cabin was the longest mile of Arthur's life. The sun beat down, and the silence between them was thick enough to choke on. He had mumbled something about seeing her home, an automatic gesture of propriety that now felt like the first step in a life sentence. The town had watched them go, whispering behind their hands. He could feel their judgment like a physical weight. He kept glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace, her gaze fixed on the dusty track ahead. She wasn't carrying the bowl of potato salad anymore, she'd left it on the potluck table, a small, abandoned offering. He searched for any sign of triumph, or fear, or even humor in her expression, but her face was a calm, unreadable mask. He was the one whose palms were sweating, whose stomach was tied in a knot of pure panic. "Mrs. Chen," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "About what happened back there." "You may call me My Lin," she said, without looking at him. "All right. My Lin. I need you to understand. I was not being serious. It was a fool thing to say. I was trying to stop them from staring." "And did you?" she asked. He stopped walking. "Well, yes, but that's not the point. The point is, it was a joke. A terrible one. We can't. I mean, people think we're..." She finally turned to face him, her expression patient, as if she were explaining something simple to a slow learner. "They think you asked me to be your wife, and I said yes. Both of which are true. The town heard it. The preacher heard it. What part was the joke, Mr. Vance? The asking, or the accepting?" He felt a fresh wave of heat on his face. She had him cornered with simple logic. In the public square, his intent didn't matter, only his words. The whole thing. "I can't marry you. You can't marry me. It's impossible." "Why?" she asked, the question so direct it disarmed him. "Why? Because we don't know each other. Because I'm and you. It's not how things are done." "It is how it was done today," she said, and resumed walking. He had no choice but to follow. He felt like a calf being led to the branding iron. They reached her cabin, a small, weathered structure that looked barely strong enough to stand against a stiff wind. A few meticulously tended tomato plants grew in pots by the door. It was humble but fiercely clean. Before he could formulate another sputtering protest, the sound of hoofbeats made them both turn. 3 riders were approaching, led by a large, florid man in a dusty black coat. Arthur recognized him instantly. Bartholomew Finch. He owned the bank, the freight office, and half the land in the county. His smile was as wide as his belt buckle and just as cold. "Mrs. Chen," Finch boomed, reining in his horse so it danced nervously, kicking up dust. His 2 hired men flanked him, their hands resting near their hips. "I was just coming to see if you'd reconsidered my generous offer for this little plot of yours." My Lin stepped slightly behind Arthur, a subtle movement he barely registered. "The property is not for sale, Mr. Finch." Finch's smile tightened. His gaze slid to Arthur, taking in his worn jeans and dusty hat. "Vance. I didn't realize you were in the business of real estate consultation." His tone was dismissive, bordering on insulting. Arthur felt a familiar prickle of anger. He'd had dealings with Finch's bank before, and the man had a way of making everyone feel small. Before he could think, the public role he'd been saddled with took over. "My business with My Lin is my own," he said, his voice steady. Finch laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "My Lin, is it now? Moving up in the world, are we?" He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Listen to me, woman. Your husband's claim is complicated. A judge might find it invalid, especially now that he's gone. My offer is more than fair. It will disappear by morning. I suggest you take it." The threat was unmistakable. Arthur saw a flicker of something in My Lin's eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before. He felt the weight of the situation shift. This wasn't about a social blunder anymore. This was about a wolf circling a lone sheep, and he was the only thing standing in the way. His foolish joke had put him there. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Finch and My Lin. "You heard her. The land isn't for sale." Finch stared at him, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you to say?" Her protector. The words hung in the air. Arthur took a breath. He was trapped, but maybe the trap had a purpose after all. I am, he said, the words feeling both foreign and strangely solid in his mouth. You're speaking to my future wife. So I'll thank you to address your business to both of us from now on. Finch's jaw dropped. He looked from Arthur's determined face to my Lin's calm expression and back again. The calculation in his eyes was plain to see. Bullying a lone Chinese widow was one thing. Tangling with a white landowner, even a small one, over his fiancée's property was another matter entirely. It invited legal troubles and scrutiny he clearly didn't want. He straightened in his saddle, his face a mask of false cordiality. Well, well. My congratulations. I seem to have been misinformed. He tipped his hat with mocking formality. We'll speak again. With a sharp tug on the reins, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men following close behind. The dust settled. The sudden quiet was deafening. Arthur's heart was pounding. He had faced down Bartholomew Finch. He turned to my Lin, 100 questions on his lips. But when he saw her face, the questions died. The mask of the timid widow was gone. In its place was an expression of cold, hard appraisal. She wasn't looking at him with gratitude. She was looking at him as if he were a tool she had just tested, one that had proven surprisingly effective. He realized it then, with a sinking certainty that chilled him to the bone. She had known Finch was coming. And she had known, with unnerving precision, exactly what a man like Arthur Vance would do if he thought he was defending the honor of his future wife. You used me, Arthur said, the words flat in the sudden stillness. He didn't follow her into the cabin. He stood in the doorway, a sentinel at the edge of a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to know. She didn't deny it. She moved to a small, worn table and lit a kerosene lamp, though the afternoon sun still filled the single room with light. The gesture was deliberate, a way of drawing a line between the world outside and the one in here. I did, she said, her back to him. And it worked. The simple honesty of it was more shocking than a lie. He stepped inside, letting the screen door swing shut with a soft clap. The cabin was even sparser up close. A narrow cot, a cold wood stove, a single trunk, and the small table. Everything was immaculate. There was a dignity in the poverty, a sense of order that defied the chaos of her situation. You knew Finch was coming today, he said, watching her. You knew he'd try to threaten you. He comes every week, she replied, turning to face him. The lamplight cast soft shadows on her face, making it impossible to read. Always with a new reason my husband's deed is worthless. Always with a lower offer. And the barbecue? My stupid proposal? You saw an opportunity. A man like you, Mr. Vance, she said, her voice even, is predictable. You are quiet, but you are not weak. You dislike bullies. You would not stand by and watch an injustice, especially not if your own honor was tied to it. When you made your public joke, you gave me the only weapon I have not had until now. A white man's protection. The words stung, not because they were wrong, but because they were so precisely right. He had been played, his own decency turned against him. So what is this all about? A piece of land. It is about this piece of land, she said. She walked to the large trunk at the foot of her bed, unlocked it with a small key she wore on a string around her neck, and lifted the lid. She removed a packet of papers tied with twine. She laid them on the table. This is the deed. My husband, Wei, filed it at the territorial office in Carson City. It is legal. Paid for with money he saved for 5 years working the railroad. Arthur picked it up. It looked legitimate, with the proper stamps and signatures. If this is legal, Finch can't just take it. He can if the judge is his friend. He can if the only person defending it is me. She slid another document from the packet. It was a letter, the paper worn and soft along the creases. The writing was in Chinese characters. My husband was a careful man. He saw things. Mr. Finch uses his freight company to move supplies for the railroad. He charges them for a full car, but only ships a half car. He has been stealing from the Central Pacific for years. Wei kept a record. He made copies of Finch's private ledgers. A cold dread settled in Arthur's stomach. This was far more dangerous than a simple land dispute. Where are these ledgers? Wei hid them. He wrote their location in this letter. He told me that if anything happened to him, I was to take this letter to the U.S. Marshal, not the local sheriff. The sheriff is one of Finch's men. She looked up at him, her eyes holding his. The rockslide that killed my husband was not an accident, Mr. Vance. Mr. Finch found out that Wei knew. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. He was no longer just a man caught in a social blunder. He was standing in a small cabin with a woman whose husband had been murdered, holding the evidence that could get them both killed. He understood everything now. Her composure at the barbecue, her immediate and unwavering acceptance of his joke, her calm manipulation of the entire situation. It was not cunning for its own sake, it was the desperate, calculated strategy of a survivor. He could walk away. He could go back to his ranch, tell the town it was all a misunderstanding, and ride out of the territory before Finch decided he was a loose end. No one would blame him. It was her fight, not his. He looked at her, standing so still in the lamplight. She wasn't pleading. She was simply stating the facts, offering him the truth as an explanation for her actions. She had used him, yes, but she was also trusting him with a secret that could be her death warrant. It was a strange and terrifying kind of intimacy. He placed the deed and the letter back on the table. He thought of his quiet, empty life. The lonely meals, the silent evenings. He had always told himself he preferred the solitude, but the truth was, he had never found anything worth breaking it for. Until, perhaps, now. "My name is Arthur," he said quietly. A flicker of surprise in her eyes. "My Lin," she repeated softly. "All right, my Lin," he said, the decision settling in his chest, heavy and solid. "First thing we need to do is get a copy of that letter to someone we can trust on the mail freight heading north. The territorial marshal needs to see this. Finch can't know." A small, almost imperceptible wave of relief washed over her features. It was the first unguarded emotion he had seen from her. "Thank you, Arthur." He just nodded, his mind already turning over the logistics, the dangers. He walked to the door and looked out at the fading light. His quiet life was over. He had walked to the town barbecue a lonely rancher. He was walking away from this cabin a conspirator, a fiancé, and the only shield for a woman who was braver than any man he had ever known. That night, a fire started in his barn. He woke to the frantic whinnying of his horse and the hellish orange glow against his bedroom window. He managed to get the animals out, but the barn itself, with his winter hay supply, was a total loss. He stood in the dirt, his face smudged with soot, watching the structure collapse into a roaring pillar of flame. There was no doubt in his mind who had set it. It was a message from Finch. A warning. The first move in a war he had just agreed to fight. 6 months later, the first snows of winter dusted the peaks of the Sierras. The burnt skeleton of Arthur's barn had been cleared away, and in its place stood a new, larger one, built with the help of a few neighbors who had grown tired of Bartholomew Finch's heavy-handed rule. Arthur's small cattle herd now grazed on the combined acreage of his ranch and My Lin's claim. The creek that Finch had coveted so badly now watered a small, thriving winter garden behind the cabin, protected from the frost by cold frames Arthur had built. Inside the cabin, which now had a proper stone fireplace and a new floor, a quiet domesticity had taken root. Arthur sat by the fire, mending a bridle, the smell of leather and wood smoke filling the warm air. My Lin sat at the table, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. They had been married by a traveling circuit judge 2 months after the fire, a simple ceremony with only 2 witnesses. The town had been scandalized, then curious, and finally, grudgingly, accepting. The letter had made it to the U.S. Marshal. As My Lin had suspected, the Central Pacific Railroad was already conducting its own quiet investigation into freight discrepancies. Her husband's information, detailing specific dates and cargo manifests, was the key that unlocked the entire scheme. The marshal arrived in Redemption not with a warrant for a land dispute, but with federal agents and a list of charges that included fraud, theft, and conspiracy. When they searched Finch's office, they found the original ledgers Way had copied, hidden poorly behind a false wall. Finch's arrest had shattered his empire of fear overnight. The local sheriff was implicated and removed from his post. The town of Redemption had changed its opinion of the Vances. They were no longer the scandalous mismatched couple. They were the quiet, stubborn people who had stood up to a tyrant and won. Respect had replaced gossip. Arthur finished his work on the bridle, testing the stitch with his thumb. He looked across the room at his wife. The calm, watchful mask was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment. He had long since stopped thinking about the joke that had started it all. The arrangement, born of desperation and foolishness, had slowly, imperceptibly, become a marriage. They didn't speak of love, but it was there in the way she brought him a cup of tea without asking, in the way he made sure the woodbox was always full. It was a partnership built on shared danger and mutual respect, something sturdier than romance. The Stokes boy stopped by today, Arthur said, breaking the comfortable silence. Asked if I had any work for a ranch hand. Jedediah's father had lost a great deal of money when Finch's bank failed. Mylin paused her grinding. What did you tell him? I told him I'd think on it, Arthur said. He seemed humbled. She nodded, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. That was all that needed to be said. They understood each other in the quiet spaces. Later that evening, as they prepared for another town gathering, this time to celebrate the coming Christmas, he watched her pin a small silver clip into her dark hair. He thought back to that day at the barbecue, the man he had been, adrift and alone. He had jokingly offered her his name to save her from embarrassment. But in the end, she had been the one to save him. She had given his life a purpose, a center. She had taken his empty gesture and filled it with meaning. As they stepped out into the crisp, cold night, a neighbor passing by tipped his hat. Evening, folks, he said, then added with a friendly grin, see you at the social, cowboy. Arthur felt Mylin's hand slip into his. He looked down at her, and she was smiling up at him, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. The joke had become his name, a term of endearment in a story only they truly understood. He had thought he was offering a shield to a helpless woman, but he had been wrong. He had offered his hand to a general, and she had led them both to a quiet, unexpected victory. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.